Part 3. St. Francesca Cabrini's excellent adventure across the USA, Europe, and over the Andes to South America. Mother Francesca Cabrini stood lost in thought, her eyes tracing the raindrops that streaked the window pane. She found herself at a crossroads, faced with a challenging decision that could greatly impact the future endeavors of the missionary sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the order she had founded just over a decade earlier. When she and her nuns had arrived in New York from Italy in March 1889, their primary mission was to educate poor Italian immigrants, which led to the establishment of academies, colleges, and normal schools. However, what truly distinguished Mother Cabrini's work was her commitment to founding orphanages that would provide destitute girls with a training to become virtuous Christian women. Now, 2 years later, she had received an unexpected request to manage a hospital, a task she felt was beyond her expertise. Yet, Francesca understood the pressing need for hospitals to serve Italian immigrants in the United States, many of whom were plagued by illnesses and injuries resulting from their dire living conditions and hazardous jobs. In public hospitals, they often faced neglect due to their poverty and limited English, compounded by the medical staff's inability to speak Italian. As she pondered her next steps, Francesca reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Born prematurely in 1850 in San Angelo, Italy, she had always been frail, but possessed an unconquerable spirit. As a child, the stories of missionaries had captivated her imagination and fueled her longing to serve others. Despite being rejected by several religious orders due to her health, she had founded the Institute of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in 1880 with a handful of young women. Francesca's aspirations initially pointed towards China, yet Pope Leo XIII had redirected her to America, where thousands of Italian immigrants awaited assistance. This marked a significant turning point in her life and mission. Upon arriving in New York, she quickly recognized the urgent needs of the immigrant community, both material and spiritual. Bishop Giovanni Scalabrini, a devoted advocate for Italian immigrants to the United States, had established a small hospital on East 109th Street, entrusting its management to his order, the Fathers of St. Charles Borromeo, under the direction of Father Felice Morelli. Despite the priest's commendable efforts in tending to the spiritual needs of the patients, the hospital was on the brink of disaster due to the clergy's lack of practical experience in healthcare management. Desperate to remedy the situation, Bishop Scalabrini had sought Francesca's assistance during her recent visit to Italy. He explained that without her intervention, the hospital would be forced to shut down. However, Francesca was hesitant. She feared that the demands of running a hospital would compromise the religious spirit of her nuns, and that her own aversion to physical illness would make her unsuitable for such a role. Although she had cared for patients suffering from diseases like smallpox and typhoid when necessary, managing a hospital presented an entirely different challenge. She already had sought the advice of a cardinal, who had encouraged her to undertake the task, and also had received a letter of recommendation from the cardinal vicar in Rome. The decision weighed heavily on her heart as she considered how it might transform lives within the immigrant community she had come to love so deeply. Yet she remained uncertain. Faced with this dilemma, Francesca turned to her usual source of guidance, prayer. She closed the curtains against the gloomy rain, and went to the convent's chapel, where she knelt in front of the statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. There, once again, she poured out all her questions and concerns, praying fervently to be shown the right path. That night, she had a vivid dream in which she saw the Virgin Mary, sleeves rolled up and skirt pinned back, moving through a hospital ward, comforting the sick. When Francesca rushed to offer her help, Our Lady turned to her and said, "I am doing what you refused to do." This dream left Francesca with no doubt about her path forward, and she promptly assigned 10 nuns to the Scalabrini Hospital. In October 1891, she traveled to Nicaragua and New Orleans to open missions there. However, when she learned the following spring that, despite the nuns' valiant efforts, the hospital had failed, she rushed back to address the situation. She quickly discovered the root of the problem. Contrary to her intentions, the sisters were still under the control of Father Morelli, who had not paid them the promised $25 per month. Additionally, Francesca was expected to assume responsibility for a substantial debt that had accumulated even before she had sent her sisters there. Francesca refused to pay off the old debts unless her order could gain ownership of the hospital. Unfortunately, this became impossible when the property was foreclosed that summer. As negotiations regarding the distribution of furnishings stalled, complicated by the fact that the nuns had not been compensated for a year, Francesca made a difficult decision. She and her sisters would amicably part ways with the Scalabrinian fathers. In a show of support, Archbishop Corrigan of New York provided Francesca with $50 and recommended her to 4 wealthy Italians in the city. With a total of $250 collected from these benefactors, she rented 2 adjoining houses on 12th Street and established her own hospital. She transferred 10 patients from the failed hospital to this new facility. The donated funds allowed her to cover the first month's rent and purchase 10 inexpensive beds. The nuns crafted the mattresses themselves and sewed sheets from a large bale of fabric. For the first week, there was no water or gas for cooking, so the sisters bought food from a nearby restaurant and heated it on a coal stove positioned in the center of the ward. Their meager pharmacy consisted of a dozen bottles of medicine. A writing desk and surgical instruments were donated by a doctor, while another donor provided an ambulance. Lacking funds for their own beds, the sisters slept on the floor. Despite these hardships and the criticism that naturally followed, the sisters' steadfast devotion more than compensated for their lack of supplies. They cared for their patients with kindness and compassion, placing their confidence in Mother Cabrini and following her example of total trust in God. When it came time to name their new facility in 1892, Francesca chose Columbus Hospital, explaining that the year marked the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World. She declared, "He was the first Italian immigrant. If we call it after him, all the Italian immigrants will know that this is their hospital." She would subsequently give the same name to all future hospitals she founded in America. The very first patients at Columbus Hospital were too poor to pay for their care, but Dr. Keene, the head physician, generously offered his services free of charge. He was resolute in his commitment to the hospital's mission, dismissing any staff doctor who attempted to charge a fee. Alongside Dr. Keene, other charitable doctors, several of whom were Protestants, joined the staff and referred their private paying patients to Columbus Hospital, providing a crucial source of income. As word spread about the hospital's dedication to serving the needy, Donations of money and equipment began to pour in, allowing the small hospital to steadily grow. Feeling confident that the sisters could manage the hospital, Francesca returned to Italy in October of 1892 to visit the nuns at the original mother house in Codogno and in various convents scattered throughout the country. During her visit, she had the opportunity to meet with Pope Leo XIII, who was celebrating the 50th Jubilee of his consecration as a bishop. These trips to Italy were essential for Francesca's spiritual renewal. She often felt the need to retreat to the quiet life of the cloister, which refreshed her for her future endeavors. She returned to New York in 1895 to find Columbus Hospital thriving. A pivotal moment had occurred when an Italian warship docked in New York, carrying 2 sailors suffering from typhoid fever. After being turned away from other facilities, the missionary sisters welcomed them into Columbus Hospital, gaining significant publicity when the Italian admiral visited. This led to an arrangement with the Italian consul general, allowing any sick Italian sailor on a merchant vessel to be admitted for a flat fee. Although finances remained tight, this official recognition ensured that the hospital was consistently full. In March 1895, Columbus Hospital received formal approval from the state of New York and was legally incorporated. That same year, it was relocated to East 19th Street, and in 1973 would merge with another hospital, transforming into the Cabrini Medical Center at 226 East 20th Street, where it operated until its closure in 2008. With the hospital's future secured, Mother Cabrini was free to embark on a new journey to South America. First, she traveled to New Orleans to check on her mission there, staying for 2 days before sailing onward. The mission she and her sisters had established in Grenada, Nicaragua, had been closed by the government following a revolution, forcing the sisters to relocate to Panama. Francesca intended to visit them before continuing on to Argentina. In Panama, Francesca was captivated by the mission's stunning location overlooking the sea. In one of her letters, she described it vividly. One can imagine oneself to be on board a steamer because on the south and southwest it is surrounded by the sea. The room the sisters prepared for me is surrounded on 2 sides by large orange trees, the fruit of which touches my windowsill. One looks out on a path leading to the sea and its beautiful isles which seem to be playing in the bay. In our garden, we have 6 kinds of palms, banana and coffee trees, and various kinds of fruit, the names of which I do not know. She cherished the tranquility of this beautiful place, despite the fact that 30 girls practiced the piano every day and 12 girls had singing lessons. "You can imagine our eardrums," she wrote with her characteristic humor. After spending 4.5 months in Panama, Mother Cabrini set out with Mother Chiara for what would become her longest and most adventurous journey. Their destination was Buenos Aires, where the Archbishop had requested her assistance in opening a school. They planned to travel down South America's coast to Chile, and then cross the Andes into Argentina. During this voyage, Francesca crossed the equator for the first time. During an especially dull stretch of scenery, she took advantage of her background as a former teacher and lover of geography by writing a little lecture about the area for her nuns back home. While making a long stop in Callao, Peru, Francesca and her companion ventured into Lima to visit St. Rosa's burial shrine. The ship continued its leisurely journey toward Valparaiso, making frequent stops along the way. When they arrived in Santiago, Chile, at the foot of the Andes Mountains, They received advice from the Archbishop to rest for a while because the Archbishop of Buenos Aires had passed away, making immediate travel unnecessary. Though Francesca chafed at this delay in her plans, she recognized that there was little choice. Heavy snow blocked the access through the Andes, and it would be several weeks before the first caravan of the season could depart. Her traveling companion, Mother Chiara, was a timid and sickly woman, so Francesca had offered her the choice of their going around Cape Horn by ship or crossing the Andes Mountains. Mother Chiara, who hated sea voyages, chose the Andes route. On November 24th, during the spring season in the Southern Hemisphere, their journey across the Andes began. The first segment was by train, which navigated precariously along the mountains, hugging the edges of vast gorges so deep that the bottom was invisible. At the railway's end, they transferred to mule-drawn coaches that trailed the river along a winding road bordering a deep chasm where turbulent waters churned far below. This marked the beginning of the Cumber Pass. Only dark green pine trees dotted the landscape, while a huge volcano towered above them. After a long day of travel, the coaches halted, and the passengers eagerly devoured a simple supper. Later, the two nuns stepped outside into the night to admire the brilliant moonlight that bathed the mountains in a lovely blue glow reflecting off the snow. Francesca mused that the night's beauty resembled that of the Virgin Mary. With this uplifting thought, she and Mother Chiara retired to their inn for the night. Exhausted from their travels, they fell into a deep sleep, but were roused at 3:30 a.m. by the sounds of the mules being saddled. They donned long, brown, hooded capes lined with fur, gifts from the ladies in Santiago, preparing for their mountain crossing. The best mules were assigned to them, which meant that they would ride at the front of the line. Tiny Francesca had to stand on a chair to mount her mule. The first hour of their journey was relatively easy. However, they soon found themselves navigating through deep snow as the path vanished. Two muleteer guides led them along a trail that often skirted a precipice. Francesca's mule was curious about the edge, and despite her shouted warnings in limited Spanish and frantic attempts to pull its head away, the mule remained undeterred. Francesca glanced over at Mother Chiara, who lay limply on her mule's back, clearly regretting her decision to traverse the Andes instead of opting for a ship voyage. Yet, despite the perilous conditions, the view was breathtaking. An immense abyss on one side, and an expansive stretch of sparkling white snow on the other, with the mountains they still had to cross looming ahead. Suddenly, one of the guides halted and instructed everyone to dismount. Something was amiss. Before them lay a long and terrifyingly deep crevice. The men managed to get some mules to leap across it and inform the travelers they would need to do the same on their mounts. Being at the front meant Francesca had to make the first jump. Bravely, she agreed, confident she would clear it without issue. However, the intense cold and high altitude had sapped her strength, and as her mule leaped, she lost her grip. She began to slide off down the chasm and would certainly have fallen to her death if not for the quick reflexes of a vigilant muleteer who threw himself across and caught her just in time. With assistance from his hiking stick and his fellow guide, he pulled Francesca safely to solid ground, where she promptly fainted into a snowbank. When she regained consciousness, she found that all her companions had successfully leapt across. Remounting her mule by standing on a boulder, she and the cavalcade continued their adventurous trek. Soon, Francesca recovered from her alarming experience and began to appreciate once again the stunning scenery around them. As they approached the border between Chile and Argentina, they descended the mountain through a feathery snowfall and stopped at an inn for lunch. When asked to write in the visitor's book, Francesca became the first person ever to express something positive about the crossing. Despite its dangers, she had relished every moment of this adventure. In her diary letter to the nuns back home, she reflected, "I was very pleased to have ascended such high mountains, which gave me an inducement to incite myself to ascend the heights of spiritual perfection, a peak much higher than any in the Andes. Prayer, confidence, and total abandonment to God will always be our arms. We are good for nothing, but I can do all things in Him who strengthens me." Francesca and Mother Chiara arrived in Buenos Aires, a city where she was virtually unknown because the archbishop who had invited her had since passed away. Fortunately, she remembered a priest, Father Broghi, whom she had met in Genoa 2 years prior. He welcomed them cordially and treated them to a delightful Italian dinner. Afterward, he introduced them to the new archbishop, Ladislao Castellano, a warm and fatherly man who assured Francesca that he would provide all the support his predecessor had promised. During this time, she also met the influential clergy of the diocese, who were in the city for a procession to a shrine of Our Lady to welcome the new archbishop. These priests quickly fell under the spell of Francesca's famous, though unconscious, charm, and she received all the assistance she needed. The Sisters of Mercy took the two nuns in until they could establish their own convent. Father Broghi guided them around the city, introducing them to individuals who would be instrumental in their mission. As was her custom, Francesca walked through the city each day, searching for potential houses for her new school and returning home exhausted every evening. Yet she persevered and inspected 60 possible locations. One day, at the very spot where her worn shoes finally fell to pieces, she found a house that met all her needs. Despite warnings that her choice was a grave mistake due to its high cost, she nonetheless insisted that she had a secret inspiration and would take the house at any price. Without hesitation, she cabled New York and Italy for sisters to leave immediately for Buenos Aires, alarming Father Broghi, who thought this decision was rash and premature. She reassured him, "Don't worry, Father. If I were to think too much about procuring the means, the Lord would withhold His graces." On Christmas Day, she took possession of the house and wasted no time preparing it for the incoming sisters. One day, Archbishop Castellano came to visit. When Francesca opened the door, he didn't recognize her at first, as she was clad in an apron, wielding a broom and duster. He asked to see Mother Cabrini, to which she replied, "Certainly, Your Excellency. Please sit down in the parlor and I will call her." She hurried away and returned moments later without her apron and cleaning tools, her face and hands freshly washed. The Archbishop burst into laughter. However, Francesca was never one to shirk domestic responsibilities. As often happened with her business decisions, what seemed rash turned out to be brilliant. She later reflected, "The courage shown in undertaking a difficult enterprise made a good impression on the people, so much so that the principal families brought us their children, and this went on so well that when we left, the academy was already full, and I had to arrange for a second and larger house." Although some students came from Italian families, most did not. South America lacked quality schools at that time, making these capable Italian nuns most welcome. After establishing her school in Buenos Aires, Francesca set sail back to Italy. During the voyage, eager to expand her mission further into Spanish America, Mother Cabrini sought more knowledge about Spain and its people, with hopes of opening a house there and recruiting Spanish nuns. In Rome, she met once again with her old friend Pope Leo XIII to receive his blessing. Noticing her poor health, he inquired how she managed such extensive work. She smiled brightly and replied, "Holy Father, I am your spiritual daughter. That is what gives me the necessary moral strength. I am not going to lose my health by serving that dear Jesus who made me a missionary of his Sacred Heart." 3 weeks later, she arrived in Paris, where she longed to open a house. But initial efforts were met with difficulty. Archbishop Cardinal Richard was away, and his vicar general denied Francesca permission to proceed until his return. Unable to sway him otherwise, she and Sister Frances, a young Irish nun, took refuge with Madame de Mere, whose sister attended the missionary school in Panama. The woman was frail. While she occasionally conversed with the nuns, most of her time was spent resting in her room. Though Madame de Mere had abandoned religious practice years prior, Mother Cabrini's influence inspired her return to the Catholic faith. Sadly, upon Madame de Mere's death several weeks later, Francesca and Sister Frances found themselves without shelter and still without permission to open a convent in Paris. However, Madame de Mere had left Francesca some valuable furniture in her will, too luxurious for a convent, but suitable for equipping a boarding house for affluent ladies, which Francesca undertook as a temporary solution to help establish a foothold in Paris while potentially attracting French vocations. On September 8th, she finally received permission from Cardinal Richard to establish herself in the same parish where her new boarding house was located. By September 29th, 7 sisters had arrived from Italy, and they opened their house. Because it was far too grand for a convent setting, the nuns occupied the servants' quarters while converting the coach house into their refectory. The elegant residence appealed to exactly the kind of ladies they wished to attract, and on October 1st, their first paying boarders arrived. With Paris now established as part of her mission field, Francesca and Sister Frances traveled to England for 10 days, where she instantly fell in love with London and its polite people who were always willing to help. She wrote, "In other countries they speak of nobility and courtesy. In London they practice them. I was astonished at the courtesy shown me, and inwardly implored blessings on this country of England, which I should love to call, if possible, the land of angels." Although she was there with intentions of establishing an orphanage for Italian children, this project would ultimately need postponement for several years. Francesca spent the majority of 1899 dedicated to establishing schools for impoverished Italian children across New York, Newark, New Jersey, and Scranton, PA. She also opened a boarding school for the children of affluent Italians who often required spiritual guidance to maintain their faith. This establishment, known as Sacred Heart Villa, was located at 190th Street and Fort Washington Avenue in New York. It became not only the American novitiate, but also the closest thing Francesca ever had to a settled home. In later years, Sacred Heart Villa would evolve into Mother Cabrini High School. That same year, she was invited to open a mission in Chicago, where the immigrant population faced challenges similar to those in New York. Following the Civil War, Chicago had transformed into a major urban center, second only to New York. The demand for cheap labor surged due to numerous factories and infrastructure projects like railroads and bridges. Unfortunately, many areas rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871 were filled with unsafe and unhealthy wooden tenements that housed Italians alongside Black migrants from the South and various other immigrant groups, including Jews, Greeks, Croatians, Russians, Lithuanians, Poles, and Mexicans. Living conditions were dire. Unsanitary plumbing was common. Alleyways overflowed with garbage and dead animals, and toilets often backed up. Rats posed a significant threat to infants. Families resorted to sleeping with guns under their beds to fend off these pests at night, and food had to be stored in tin boxes or suspended from ceilings by ropes or wires. Such conditions bred diseases like typhoid and impetigo in summer, and rheumatism, tuberculosis, and pneumonia in winter. Immigrants faced constant peril in factories, where lost limbs or death were everyday risks. Yet, amidst these horrors, a small but ambitious group of immigrants began launching their own businesses, which eventually flourished. In May 1899, Francesca traveled to Chicago with 14 of her sisters. Father Morachini of the Servite Fathers had prepared a building for her at his parish of the Church of the Assumption. Francesca's task would be to organize both students and faculty in this burgeoning city. Her greatest aspiration was always focused on educating children, whom she envisioned as soldiers ready to combat the evils their parents had endured. Soon her school at the Church of the Assumption boasted 700 students. Before leaving Chicago, she laid plans for an orphanage and a potential hospital. She then sailed back to Europe. Exhausted from her labors, she collapsed into a deck chair for some much-needed rest. Sea voyages were as close as she ever got to a vacation. Upon regaining some strength, she wrote to her nuns, "How lovely and sweet it is to undertake a sea voyage when one is tired and worn out with the labors of the missions. I'm like a fish. I feel better on sea than on land, and eat with a better appetite." Her journey included stops in Paris and Lourdes before continuing on to Spain, where she opened a school and college in Madrid, along with 2 orphanages in Bilbao before returning to Italy. From birth, Francesca had always been frail, and a near-drowning incident in her childhood had left her with compromised lungs. When she founded her order in 1880, she had been advised that she likely only had a couple of years to live. In 1889, when she first came to America, she was again warned that her health would not be able to stand the stress and strain. But she would only smile at these warnings. Putting all her trust in God, she knew that if He had called her to this work, He would make sure she had the strength to see it through. By 1900, Francesca was 50 years old, and although her face retained its youthful appearance, her health was gradually declining due to extreme fatigue and fevers. Nevertheless, once in Italy, instead of succumbing to illness, she opened a chapel and school in Rome, an orphanage in Mariscano, convents in San Raffaele and Città della Pieve, an exclusive academy for upper-class girls, and a sanitarium for sick nuns in Torino. Francesca then spent 7 months in Argentina, visiting not only Buenos Aires, where her schools were thriving, but also the Pampas, where many scattered groups of Italian immigrants worked. She had learned that her sisters in Panama had been forced to leave that country due to civil war. Despite the fact that they had tirelessly nursed the sick during outbreaks of typhoid, yellow fever, and bubonic plague, and also those wounded in the conflict, the sisters had been ordered away from Panama. Francesca promptly reassigned them to her schools in Argentina, while welcoming the new South American novices who were starting to arrive. When she returned to Italy in the spring of 1902, Francesca Cabrini found herself gravely ill, confined to her bed, with the specter of death looming once more. In her weakened state, she began making arrangements for the governance of her institute after her passing. However, On March 19th, the feast of St. Joseph, a basket of oranges arrived from the Vatican Gardens, a thoughtful gift from her steadfast friend and patron, Pope Leo XIII. Despite not having eaten for days, Francesca took one of the oranges and declared it delicious, claiming it had restored her energy. She soon recovered enough to visit the Pope, who bestowed upon her a blessing that would be his last for her. He passed away the following summer at the age of 93. With renewed vigor, Francesca set out to visit her many convents across Italy and Spain. The elegant boarding house in Paris was relinquished in favor of an orphanage in Neuilly. Yet her primary focus shifted towards founding a convent in London. With the support of Bishop Bourne of Southwark, she established a house at Brockley, which would later move to nearby Honor Oak. She was now free to return to the United States, where she would spend the next 4 years. Francesca's aspirations led her toward the Rocky Mountains, with hopes of eventually reaching the Pacific coast. Her immediate mission was to assist Italian immigrants laboring in Colorado's mining fields. Although these immigrants fared better materially than others across the nation, they still faced challenges. Separated from their families, with limited opportunities to practice their Catholic faith, they faced great temptations presented by their lucrative wages in the gold and silver mines. Setting up headquarters in Denver, Francesca and her nuns traversed rugged terrain to reach miners working underground. They descended hundreds of feet into dark shafts, walking miles along tunnels to offer brief moments of connection during lunch breaks. The miners deeply appreciated these visits. They had felt isolated and forgotten until uplifted by the presence of these kind nuns who spoke their language. In recognition of their positive impact on worker morale, the mine superintendent provided accommodations for them, where they would sometimes stay for several days. During these interactions, Francesca learned about the pressing need for a hospital and orphanage because of frequent injuries or fatalities that left many children homeless. Starting with a small school on Palmer Avenue for immigrant children who lacked parental supervision, Francesca later returned to Denver and strategically acquired a large property on the city's outskirts. Despite initial protests from the bishop regarding its isolation, Francesca's keen understanding of maps and population trends proved invaluable as she secured properties that would thrive as the cities developed. Denver soon expanded in the direction of her property, constructing streetcar lines into what would become thriving suburbs. She returned east and established St. Anthony's Orphanage in Arlington, New Jersey. She also added an annex to the Columbus Hospital in New York. Francesca demonstrated remarkable financial acumen in managing her projects. While she sought donations from Italian communities, yielding modest sums, for larger amounts, she also approached wealthy benefactors with surprising success. One notable encounter was with a Mr. Wentworth. After several unsuccessful attempts to meet with him, she finally cornered him outside his office one day. He asked her what she was selling. She declared, "Sell, Mr. Wentworth? Only children." She passionately shared her dreams with him, leaving that day with a generous contribution. Despite her aversion to begging, Francesca excelled at it by framing requests as opportunities for the donors, telling them, "In asking you for something, I am conferring a privilege upon you, the chance to do some good." Her bright blue eyes and infectious smile made it hard for potential donors to refuse her appeals. They could only stare at her, dumbfounded, and reach for their checkbook. As she often remarked to her fellow nuns, "We have nothing, yet we spend millions." Long before women's liberation, Mother Francesca Cabrini employed all the skills of the greatest female CEOs. In 1903, she returned to Chicago with plans to establish a hospital. One snowy April day, she spotted the 6-story North Shore Hotel on Lincoln Park's edge, a prime location, selling for the bargain price of $160,000 due to previous mismanagement. Despite raising only $1,000 initially, much to the Archbishop's amusement, Francesca's relentless spirit led her back into Chicago's Italian community, where she successfully raised $10,000. Encouraged by the Archbishop to proceed with purchasing the hotel despite her trepidation, Francesca's astuteness soon became evident during negotiations, when she suspected some deception regarding the property measurements. She sent 2 sisters out with string and chalk to measure the lot accurately before signing any documents. The sellers of the property soon learned that although she was a woman and a foreigner, 2 strikes against her in that era, Francesca was not one to be easily deceived. They had, in fact, been secretly intent on retaining 25 feet of the property for their own use. Seeing that they were defeated, they agreed to her terms. As a wise businessman once noted, one does not fool with Mother Cabrini. However, when the time came to renovate the hotel into a hospital, unscrupulous contractors again tried to cheat the nuns. Francesca then took charge of the project herself, acting as chief contractor and retaining only the honest workmen. The dishonest ones she fired, after paying them only what was fair and not a penny more. She made friends with the remaining workers, fostering camaraderie while ensuring efficiency, and renovations expected to take 12 months were completed in just 8. Donations poured in, not only from Italians, but also from non-Italian Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. An eminent Catholic surgeon named John B. Murphy offered his services to Francesca's hospital, acting as president and head of staff, and he was the one she turned to for medical advice. On April 26, 1905, the Columbus Hospital of Chicago officially opened its doors. Francesca Cabrini's legacy extends beyond her establishment of orphanages, schools, and hospitals. She also exhibited profound compassion for prisoners. She started this ministry at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, where she communicated with Italian inmates in their native language, a necessity since none of the official chaplains spoke Italian. To address this gap, she arranged for Italian-speaking priests to visit the prison for confessions, while her own nuns made regular visits several times a week. The prisoners on death row especially received tender compassion and comfort. In New Orleans, her missionary sisters visited a young black man sentenced to hang, offering him solace and helping him reconcile with God before his execution. On the occasion of Mother Cabrini's 25th anniversary, the prisoners at Sing Sing sent her a beautifully illustrated message of gratitude. Additionally, inmates from a Chicago prison contributed funds for a horse and carriage to facilitate the sisters' visits. Despite suffering from a high fever, Francesca journeyed to the West Coast, where she opened a small orphanage, parochial school, and modest wooden chapel in Seattle. She even wielded a pickaxe herself for the chapel's construction, placing a note and religious medals into its foundation. During her return trip, an attempted train robbery occurred, and a rifle shot pierced the train window precisely where Francesca had been sitting moments before she leaned forward to better hear the nun traveling with her. When the frightened conductor pointed out how narrowly she had escaped death, she calmly reassured him, "Sir, that bullet could never have found me, for the Sacred Heart protects me." Chronologically summarizing Mother Cabrini's extensive travels across the U.S. during the early 1900s is challenging. Her primary bases of operation included New York, Chicago, Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. In 1905, while Francesca was in Chicago, a yellow fever epidemic ravaged New Orleans, claiming many lives among poor immigrants in the overcrowded slums. Often, it was only Francesca's missionary sisters who were permitted into these homes, working alongside medical authorities to alleviate the immigrants' suspicion of doctors and nurses. Miraculously, not one sister contracted the illness despite their constant exposure. In the fall of 1905, Francesca traveled to Los Angeles with plans to assist both Italian and Mexican immigrants. There, she established an orphanage on Sunset Boulevard, a school on Alpine Street, and a sanitarium in Burbank for children suffering from tuberculosis or at risk of contracting it. By this time, Mother Cabrini had gained recognition among Italians everywhere. The Italian government officially praised her efforts and provided some financial support for her work. She was honored by the Queen of Italy and acknowledged by politicians who conceded that she did more for immigrants than all other agencies combined. As one biographer noted, the name Mother Cabrini began to sound like music to the ears of the clergy and civil authorities, and of all Italians as well. There had never been, and has not been since, a woman in America quite like Mother Cabrini. As Americans witnessed the flourishing communities under her influence, hospitals, orphanages, schools, religious and social centers, they gradually began to respect immigrants and shed ignorant prejudices. Although she had become a public figure celebrated for her accomplishments, Mother Cabrini hated the spotlight and refused to allow her picture to be published in newspapers. By this stage in her life, she yearned for a retirement of peaceful contemplation, hoping to pass on the mission work to her younger and stronger nuns. This dream, however, would never materialize. At the end of 1907, Francesca Cabrini once again set sail for Buenos Aires to visit her school, this time by boat from Barcelona instead of by mule across the Andes. After her visit, she continued on to Brazil, where her sisters had established a school in Sao Paulo. Her journey then took her to Rio de Janeiro, but during the train ride through mosquito-infested marshlands, she contracted malaria and fell ill for several weeks. Despite her weakened state, she managed to open a school in Rio. However, shortly after its opening, a smallpox epidemic swept through the city, affecting several of the nuns. The first sister to contract the disease tragically died because the authorities insisted she be taken to the public plague house, where she received inadequate care. Distraught over this, Francesca quickly arranged for a cottage outside the city for the remaining sick nuns, nursing them tirelessly, just as her sister Rosa had cared for her during her own battle with smallpox decades ago in Italy. After returning to the United States, Francesca dedicated the next 2 years to visiting all her houses across the country. In 1910, she was approached by the Archbishop of Chicago with a request to open a second hospital. She discovered a prime property in an affluent neighborhood which was generously donated to the sisters. However, local wealthy residents opposed having a free hospital in their community and attempted to dissuade Mother Cabrini through bribery and political pressure. When these tactics failed, they resorted to vandalism by cutting the water pipes on a frigid night. The resulting flood froze into thick layers of ice, which Francesca and her sisters, along with some immigrant supporters, laboriously hacked away with pickaxes. After repairing the damage and making a few rooms livable, Francesca moved in to ensure that the building remained guarded at night. Their adversaries were undeterred, and one night arsonists broke into the basement and set it on fire. Fortunately, the sisters and the fire department managed to extinguish the blaze. The following evening, however, the arsonists returned. This time, Francesca was prepared. She dashed into the street shouting for the police. The frightened criminals fled, and although they were never apprehended, they never returned. Ultimately, the hospital opened and was so well received that many individuals and organizations within the community rallied together to support its ongoing operation. Once the hospital was established and thriving, Francesca returned to Italy with plans to announce at the Rome Mother House her intention to retire and to request that a replacement be elected as Superior General. However, the sisters were shocked and dismayed at the thought of losing their beloved mother foundress. They conspired to fulfill her request by electing a superior who would serve for life. But that superior turned out to be Mother Cabrini herself. Surrounded by her joyful sisters at her birthday celebration, where she was informed by the cardinal of this decision, she graciously accepted their choice and relinquished her dream of a peaceful retirement at West Park. While in Italy, Francesca sought out Antonia Tondini, her old nemesis who had caused her so much distress while she was a young woman caring for orphans at the House of Providence. Antonia was brought into the convent's reception room, where Francesca warmly embraced her and said, "Please forgive me for any trouble I involuntarily may have caused you." Confused and overwhelmed with emotion, Antonia began to tremble and weep. Afterward, a nun asked Francesca, "Didn't she make you suffer terribly?" To which Francesca replied with remarkable grace, "Antonia Tondini was given by God not to know any better. She truly thought that when she treated me as she did, it was for my own good." This exemplified the profound forgiveness that dwelt in Francesca Cabrini's magnificent heart. She recognized that all she endured at the House of Providence had been a crucible, preparing her for her great mission. That summer, she embarked on a journey to Paris and London, seeking new houses to replace the original ones that required expansion. Her stay in London lasted 10 months, but before returning to the United States, she was compelled to return to Italy for some much-needed rest. In December, she visited Rome, where she fell gravely ill. By mid-March, her health had improved somewhat, and she abruptly announced her need to return to New York because the hospital there required her presence. On March 27, 1911, she set sail from Naples on what would become her final sea voyage. She had a strong sense that she would never return to her homeland. As usual, the sea air invigorated her, restoring some of her strength. Back in New York, she faced challenges in raising the necessary funds for a new Columbus hospital to replace the old one, whose needs had outgrown its capacity. Undeterred by these obstacles, she enlisted a young architect to design a 10-story building that would eventually rise at 227 East 19th Street. Unfortunately, due to delays caused by World War I, she would not live to see its completion. In July, while visiting West Park, she burst out of her room one morning, exclaiming that she was dying. Though she did not pass away at that time, the nuns insisted on sending her to the Mount of the Holy Cross in Colorado, a health refuge for sick nuns donated by a benefactor. Once well enough to travel, she made her way there. A fellow nun tended to her needs in a log cabin nestled among glistening snow atop the mountain. She cherished the tranquility of the place, and especially loved watching the eagles soar high above her. She spent much time in peaceful meditation, gradually regaining her strength. As soon as she was able, she ventured to Los Angeles, where another school was desperately needed. She purchased 4 lots, but struggled to gather enough funds to construct the school. Lacking money for a contractor, she sent for Sister Silesia, a bricklayer's daughter with considerable building skills. At that time, the Luna amusement park was slated for demolition. Mother Cabrini negotiated for the rights to salvage the wooden structures set for destruction. She hired skilled Italian carpenters and laborers on a daily basis and arranged for horses and wagons to transport the materials. The parish community rallied together as well, helping dismantle the frame structures of Luna Park. Francesca was often on site supervising the work, sporting a wide-brimmed Mexican sombrero and carrying a bamboo cane. At noon each day, she drove a horse and cart between Luna Park and the new building site, delivering wine, coffee, sandwiches, and sweets to everyone laboring there. Despite the strenuous work, laughter, singing, and prayer lightened their spirits. After a month of hard work collecting building materials, Francesca found herself with more than enough for the Los Angeles school, so she arranged for the surplus materials to be shipped by freight car to expand the Denver orphanage. Leaving Sister Silesia in charge, Francesca traveled to Seattle, where an orphanage was threatened by a planned highway expansion. The orphans needed relocation, prompting her search for a new site. Exhausted from countless trips through the city, Francesca spread a map of Seattle on the table, pointed to a spot, and instructed the sisters to explore that location and report back. That evening, the excited nuns returned with news. They had discovered what they called a little paradise on earth. With a knowing smile, Francesca replied, "Yes, I knew it would be beautiful. I saw it all in a dream last night." The following day, they visited the villa, perched on a hill with breathtaking views. The owner revealed that it belonged to his wife, who loved the place and would never part with it. As they descended the hill back into town, Francesca firmly declared to her sisters, "That paradise will be for our orphans, somehow or other." As dusk fell, streetcars became scarce. Although hiring a taxi felt extravagant, the exhaustion of her companions made it seem to Francesca the only alternative. But just then, a limousine carrying an elegantly dressed woman approached them. On impulse, Francesca raised her cane, signaling for assistance. The car stopped, and the lady offered them a ride back to the convent. During their drive together, the woman learned that she was speaking with Mother Cabrini, a woman she greatly admired. When Francesca mentioned the beautiful estate they had seen earlier that day, the woman's eyes widened in astonishment. It turned out that she owned that very property. After conferring with her husband, they offered Mother Cabrini the estate at an exceptionally reasonable price. A week later, 2 wealthy American men donated $160,000, sufficient funds for establishing not only an orphanage on the property, but also an adjoining chapel. Once back in New York, she resolved to establish another orphanage closer to the city. During her search for suitable properties, she stumbled upon a stunning estate right by the river in Dobbs Ferry. One of the sisters informed her that it was a neighborhood of millionaires and the prices would be exorbitant. Moreover, the building she admired was a private school for affluent Protestant boys. Undaunted, Francesca rang the bell, which was answered by a young man whose father was the president and owner of the school. Initially cool in his demeanor, he informed Francesca that the estate was not for sale. However, as their conversation progressed, Francesca's charm began to work its magic on him. He graciously offered to give her and the other nuns a tour of the impressive building, which included classrooms, dormitories, a kitchen, dining room, chapel, gymnasium, and swimming pool, all in excellent condition. As they departed, Francesca handed the young man her card, in case his father would consider selling. Just before leaving, she bent down to tie her shoelace and discreetly pushed a medal of St. Joseph into the soft earth of a flower bed. A few days later, she received a letter from the owner asking her to make an offer on the property. Armed with her plan, Francesca approached several wealthy businessmen and successfully secured the necessary funds. With financial backing in place, she and her nuns set to work on the improvements necessary before the March 31st grand opening of what would be known as the Sacred Heart Villa at Dobbs Ferry. Francesca felt inspired by Jesus to undertake the whitewashing of the building herself. Wearing a painter's cap and pinning up her skirts, she joyfully began painting. However, the can slipped from her hand, splattering paint all over her from head to toe. Laughing, she wiped at her clothes and continued with determination. The nuns held the ladder steady as she climbed up. But when they offered to take over for her, she insisted that the whitewashing was her special task. For the next 15 days, she diligently applied her brush until the job was done. During the opening ceremony, Francesca stood alongside the cardinal. It was at this time that the last photograph of Francesca Cabrini was taken, capturing her shining eyes and serene smile as she stood with her hands folded, observing the happy orphans around her. On June 28, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Yugoslavia marked the beginning of the First World War. From that day on, a shadow was cast over Francesca's heart, and she was burdened with sorrow and concern for her missionary sisters in Europe. She prayed ceaselessly for their safety, entrusting them to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, their divine protector. Her usual smile was now tinged with sadness, and restful sleep eluded her. Only her work provided a semblance of relief. In August 1915, Francesca traveled to Seattle with plans to open an orphanage. The train journey proved arduous as she battled intermittent chills and fever, coupled with excruciating discomfort from sitting upright in coach for days on end. "If my Lord wants this mission accomplished," she confided to one of the sisters with her, "He will return to me the strength which has almost totally abandoned me." In Seattle, she found a fine building in the heart of the city, the former Perry Hotel, which had gone bankrupt. Her discreet inquiries revealed that the principal trustee was a Mr. Clark based in New York. Although lacking his first name, Francesca refrained from further inquiries to avoid alerting competing interests to her intentions. She telegraphed her nuns back in New York with a clear directive: "Find a certain Mr. Clark who is in possession of the Seattle Hotel Perry and ask it as a donation to charity." This task proved daunting with no first name, as the New York City directory listed at least 200 Clarks. Undaunted, the sisters patiently called each number until they finally located the right party, a shrewd Protestant man who was taken aback by their request for such a large donation to a Catholic charity, and adamantly refused. When they reported back to Mother Cabrini, she instructed them to return and proposed the lowest price he would accept. This time, he was struck by their sincere humility and agreed to negotiate. After numerous visits from the sisters and exchanging 90 telegrams with Mother Cabrini, he ultimately bypassed the other trustees and offered her the property for $150,000, a bargain at the time. Even the Archbishop encouraged Francesca to accept this deal. Despite her persistent fatigue, she reached out to rich and poor alike and was able to raise $10,000 as a retainer, which Mr. Clark accepted. However, opposition soon arose. The other trustees were furious, and influential local figures vehemently opposed an Italian orphanage in that location out of fear it would diminish property values. They ensured that all banks in Seattle would refuse to issue a loan to Mother Cabrini. From November through April, Francesca faced relentless struggles in securing financing for the property. During Lent, she gathered all her nuns and orphans to pray before the Blessed Sacrament, placing their hopes in Jesus, while she prepared herself to accept His will, whatever it might be. In the Seattle convent stood a statue of St. Anne holding a book and teaching young Mary to read. In desperation, Francesca wrote $120,000 in the book held by St. Anne and spent the evening in fervent prayer. While she was praying, the doorbell rang. A young nun entered to inform her that a gentleman wished to see her. When Francesca greeted him, she discovered that he was Mr. Hilberg, the Jewish president of the Scandinavian Bank. He bowed respectfully before Mother Cabrini and apologized for being out of town when she had previously visited his bank. Upon his return, he had learned about her loan denial. He expressed complete faith in her mission and offered to arrange any amount she needed. Leading him to St. Anne's statue, Francesca told him that the amount she needed was written in the book. He read it and nodded. She then invited him to join her in the reception room for a glass of wine, which he gratefully accepted. The following day, the contract was signed, and on April 30th, Mother Cabrini officially took possession of the Perry Hotel. Together with her sisters, she prayed for abundant blessings upon their great friend Mr. Hilberg for his generous support of their mission. It soon became clear that the turmoil of wartime was not an ideal backdrop for fundraising efforts aimed at establishing an orphanage. One night, Francesca had a profound dream. As she recounted to her sisters, St. Anne instructed me to relinquish my desire for a foundling home and indicated instead a hospital that will do acts of mercy and yet sustain itself. However, this goal proved to be as challenging as her initial one. The presence of an existing Catholic hospital in Seattle led some within the church to deem another one unnecessary and unwelcome. Additionally, those who had previously opposed her acquisition of the Perry Hotel were now rallying against her new plans. These factions exerted pressure on local doctors, causing them to withdraw their support from Mother Cabrini's Seattle Columbus Hospital. The situation escalated to the point where even the Archbishop forbade the opening of the facility. Although initially disheartened, Francesca soon decided to pivot her approach. Instead of a general hospital, she resolved to establish a center focused on physiotherapy and electrotherapy treatments, services that were in high demand and would not directly compete with the other Catholic hospital in Seattle. One day, a young pregnant woman from a respectable family approached the convent with a request. She wanted her baby to be born at Mother Cabrini's hospital. Several weeks before the delivery date, Mother Cabrini felt inspired to send a sister to visit the young woman's home with an urgent message to summon her doctor and come immediately to Columbus Hospital where a bed awaited her. The young lady complied, and just hours later, she gave birth to a baby girl. Due to her premature birth, the infant's survival was uncertain. Thus, Mother Cabrini herself baptized the child, naming her Columbina, which means little dove. The joyous event of the baby's birth and the happiness of the young parents, their family, friends, and doctor significantly eased the initial hostility towards Columbus Hospital. Over time, as word spread about the sisters' compassionate care, the hospital began to flourish. In the fall of 1916, Francesca sensed that her life was nearing its end and felt compelled to visit some of her other houses. She informed the sisters in Seattle of her intention to travel to Los Angeles. Her pale and fragile appearance alarmed the nuns in California, who had eagerly awaited her visit. Standing in the garden, she gazed lovingly at the sisters gathered around her. The orphans burst into the garden, running toward her and joyfully shouting, "Mama Cabrini is here!" Francesca spent the winter in the warm California sun, enjoying long hours of deep meditation amidst the beauty of the garden. The orphans frequently visited her, and she delighted in sharing candy and telling them funny stories. Birds flocked to her feet, drawn by her quiet gentleness as she spoke softly to them, scattering crumbs and seeds on the ground. One of her nuns in Los Angeles, Sister Euphemia, suffered greatly from varicose veins despite years of treatment from numerous doctors. Francesca suggested that she try wearing silk stockings to ease her discomfort. Taking this advice a step further, Sister Euphemia borrowed a pair of Mother Cabrini's own cotton stockings and put them on. To her amazement, she found immediate relief. She shared this with Mother Cabrini, who laughed off the notion, but then gently admonished her, "I hope you're not going to be so foolish as to say that my stockings cured you. It was your faith that did it." As spring approached, Francesca realized she needed to travel to Chicago due to issues arising at the new hospital. By the time she reached the Chicago Columbus Hospital on April 18, 1917, she appeared thin, bent, and frail, relying on a cane for support as she struggled to walk. The doctors quickly recognized that her malaria had worsened significantly and insisted on immediate treatment. Although the chills and fever eventually subsided over the following weeks, the treatment left her exceedingly weak. She also was suffering from chronic endocarditis, an infection involving the heart's valves and lining. Despite her frailty, Francesca rallied enough to participate in spiritual exercises at the convent that summer, being the first to arrive at the chapel each morning at 5 a.m. Following medical advice, the sisters arranged for her to be driven into the countryside daily, where she gathered wildflowers to adorn the chapel. Nostalgic for the farm life of her youth, she was inspired to purchase a farm for the institute that would provide fresh produce for the hospital. After exploring rural areas further afield, she discovered a lovely farm in Park Ridge, Illinois, which she purchased in October. She found immense joy in stocking the farm with horses, cows, goats, pigs, and chickens. By November, Francesca's health had once again deteriorated. One morning during Mass, just after receiving communion, she nearly collapsed. The sisters quickly carried her to her bed. Though her strength waned daily, she yearned to be with her daughters during their recreation periods. She loved these times with the sisters, and in the past had delighted them with her stories, and liked to play cards, although she was terrible at it and never won unless her opponents secretly let her. Mother Antonietta della Casa, the superior of the hospital, now implored her to reconsider and conserve her energy. But Francesca firmly replied, "Oh no, it is only now at their recreation that I can be together with them. If I am not, they will think I do not love them." During these cherished recreation times, she would bring them small gifts of fruit, candy, cake, or cookies, tailored to each sister's preference, as they gathered around her affectionately. On December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, she asked the sisters to write verses about the Virgin Mary. This would be the last time she could join them for recreation. Subsequently, she quietly withdrew to spiritually prepare herself for Christmas, a feast that held a special place in her heart. She ordered new habits for all of the sisters, including one for herself, secretly knowing she would be buried in it. For the order's Christmas cards, Francesca requested a verse from the Psalms to be printed. "Oh, send out thy light and thy truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me unto thy holy hill and to thy tabernacles." When a sister objected that the verse seemed more fitting for a funeral than for Christmas, Francesca smiled and insisted, "Yes, I know, but this Christmas that verse goes well. Leave it the way it is." Upon learning that the 500 children of the parish school would have to go without candy due to the difficult times, she exclaimed, "Oh no, they must have their candy. Christmas would not be Christmas for them without it." She instructed the sisters to purchase the candy at her expense. On December 21st, despite suffering from the final stages of malaria, Francesca attended Mass and joined the sisters in preparing the Christmas packages of candy for the children. The following morning, December 22, 1917, Mother Della Casa visited Francesca's room to greet her and consult about the day's tasks. A young nun came in to ask if Francesca wanted a bowl of broth. She agreed and requested that her room be tidied so she could sit in her rocking chair. Mother Della Casa returned at 11:40 a.m. with a question for Francesca. After she left, Francesca locked the door and returned to her chair to pray and meditate in solitude. While sitting there, she felt a sudden pain in her chest and got up to unlock the door and ring for help. When a sister entered, she found Francesca slumped in her wicker chair, her nightgown and handkerchief stained with blood. The young nun rushed to summon Mother Della Casa, who immediately sent for both the priest and the doctor. All the nuns hurried to Francesca's room, finding her unconscious. The priest administered last rites just as Francesca opened her eyes one final time. She leaned her head against Mother Della Casa's arm and cast a loving glance at all her sisters before drawing her last breath. A solemn requiem mass was celebrated by the Archbishop of Chicago, after which Francesca's body was transported to New York for a second requiem mass conducted by Bishop Hayes at St. Patrick's Cathedral. In accordance with her wishes, her body was interred at her beloved West Park on January 2, 1918. Hundreds of orphans dressed in white, carrying lilies and candles, followed her casket from the convent chapel to her tomb. In 1930, her remains were moved to the chapel of Mother Cabrini High School, formerly the Sacred Heart Villa, at 701 Fort Washington Avenue. In 1928, the process for her canonization began. 2 miracles are required for sainthood, and in Francesca's case, the first miracle involved an infant named Peter Smith, who was born at the New York Columbus Hospital on March 14, 1921. As was customary at the time, a nurse applied a solution of silver nitrate to the infant's eyes. As she put the bottle down, she realized with horror that in her haste, she had used a 50% solution instead of the intended 1%, resulting in severe chemical burns to the baby's eyes. An eye specialist, along with other doctors, concluded that there was nothing they could do. The corneas of the eyes were destroyed, and the child would be permanently blind. The Mother Superior rushed in with a relic of Mother Cabrini, placed it on the baby's eyes, and then pinned it to his nightgown. She and the sisters, along with the nurse involved, spent the entire night praying in the chapel for a miracle. The following morning, when the doctors returned to examine baby Peter, they were astonished to find his eyes intact and perfectly normal. However, that same day, the infant developed double pneumonia with a temperature reaching 108 degrees Fahrenheit, just 1 degree short of fatal. The doctor advised the Mother Superior to start praying again, as the baby's condition was critical. "Doctor," she replied confidently, "Mother Cabrini has not cured his eyes just to let him die of pneumonia." They prayed once more, pleading for a second miracle. By morning, all symptoms of pneumonia had vanished. Peter Smith grew up healthy with normal vision, and as a young man served as a soldier in the Army. The only remnants of his hospital ordeal were 2 small scars from the silver nitrate that had leaked from his eyes. The second miracle involved Sister Delfina Grazioli, who had suffered since 1915 from adhesions of the gallbladder and intestines. Despite undergoing 4 surgeries, her condition showed no improvement, and she was painfully wasting away. By December 1925, doctors had given up all hope and predicted she only had a day or 2 left to live. Funeral arrangements were already underway. However, on the night of December 16th, after praying to Mother Cabrini, Sister Delfina saw her in a dream. The next morning, although still very weak, she announced that she was cured. The instantaneous healing was confirmed by the doctors, and she never experienced a recurrence of her illness. Mother Francesca Xavier Cabrini was beatified on November 13, 1938, and canonized on July 7, 1946. Throughout her life, Francesca believed that faith, simplicity, humility, and obedience were the foundations of all spiritual power. She often reminded her sisters that the only necessary mortification was to perfectly observe the rule of the order and wholeheartedly carry out their daily tasks. She prayed fervently that she would never ask her nuns to do anything she herself was unwilling to do. Francesca valued openness and candor in others and detested any pretentious displays of piety. She did not want to see her sisters carrying rosaries unless they were actively reciting them. Always gentle and kind in her approach, she never hesitated to speak her mind, but did so with compassion. Rather than giving orders, she made requests that were promptly obeyed. She discouraged self-pity and long faces among her sisters. A sense of humor and fun bubbled out of her spontaneously, gladdening the hearts of everyone who came under the spell of her infectious smile. In my research for this video series, I came across a quote from one of her biographers that described her life as a quiet whirlwind. I can think of no better description. Francesca Cabrini perfectly fulfilled the hope she had once written in her notebook. "I wish to die of love after a life of total surrender to God. Oh Jesus, I love you so much, so much. Give me a heart as large as the universe, so that I may love you, if not as much as you deserve, at least as much as I am capable of."